The breakfast rush at Maggie's diner had finally begun to thin out, leaving Sarah Jenkins with a moment to catch her breath. Her feet ached in her worn-out sneakers as she leaned against the counter, quickly tallying her tips. It wasn't a great morning, $12.35 for 3 hours of work, but she'd seen worse. Rent was due in 4 days, and she was still $87 short. She would need to pick up an extra shift this weekend, which meant calling her neighbor to watch 8-year-old Emma for a few more hours. At 29, Sarah's life was a constant juggling act. Single motherhood, 2 jobs, night classes for her associate's degree, and the ever-present anxiety about money. The apartment she and Emma shared was small and in need of repairs. The landlord consistently ignored, but it was all she could afford on her waitress salary combined with her evening job as a grocery store cashier. Just keep going, she told herself, the mantra she'd repeated daily since Emma's father had walked out 6 years ago, leaving nothing but a hastily scrawled note and a mountain of debt Sarah was still paying off. One day at a time. "Sarah, you've got a customer at table 7, called Darlene, the 60-something hostess who had worked at Maggie's for over 20 years. Darlene's lined face held a mixture of sympathy and concern as she glanced toward the corner booth. "He's one of your regulars." Sarah followed Darlene's gaze and immediately recognized the elderly man who had just been seated. Mr. Wilson came in every Wednesday morning, always ordered the same thing: black coffee, scrambled eggs, wheat toast, no butter, and left a precise 15% tip. Not generous, but reliable. Today, however, something was different. Mr. Wilson seemed smaller somehow, hunched over the laminated menu he already knew by heart. His weathered hands trembled slightly, and the faded Vietnam veteran's cap he always wore sat askew on his thinning white hair. "Good morning, Mr. Wilson," Sarah greeted him with the genuine warmth she reserved for her regulars. "The usual today?" He looked up, and Sarah was startled by the redness around his eyes. Had he been crying? "Oh, hello, Sarah," his voice sounded hoarse. "Yes, the usual would be fine, thank you." Sarah hesitated, concern overriding her typical professional boundaries. "Is everything all right, Mr. Wilson? You seem a bit upset this morning." The old man's composure cracked slightly. It's the anniversary. My buddy Mike, we served together in Nam. He didn't make it home." His voice caught. 54 years ago today." "I'm so sorry," Sarah said softly, understanding washing over her. She had noticed the Vietnam veteran's cap, of course, but had never pried into his service. Mr. Wilson straightened slightly, attempting to regain his dignity. "It's fine. Old memories, that's all. The usual breakfast will be just fine." Sarah nodded and walked away, giving him the space she sensed he needed. As she placed his order with the kitchen, she noticed Mr. Wilson pull something from his wallet, a faded photograph from the looks of it. He stared at it intently, his shoulders beginning to shake slightly. When Sarah returned with his coffee, she pretended not to notice the tears he quickly wiped away. "Cream's on the table if you need it," she said lightly. "Food should be up in about 5 minutes." "Thank you, dear." Mr. Wilson attempted a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Throughout the next 15 minutes, Sarah kept a discreet watch on table 7 as she served her other customers. Mr. Wilson barely touched his food when it arrived, pushing the eggs around his plate and taking only the occasional sip of coffee. When she came to refill his cup, she noticed his hands were still trembling. "Can I get you anything else, Mr. Wilson?" she asked gently. He looked up, seeming almost surprised to see her there. "No, thank you. Just the check when you have a moment." Sarah nodded and printed his check, $8.75, the same amount he paid every Wednesday. She slid it onto his table with a small smile before moving on to her other customers. A few minutes later, she returned to find Mr. Wilson still sitting there, staring at the check with a stricken expression. The photograph lay beside his plate. A group of young soldiers, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera with the bravado of youth. "Mr. Wilson?" Sarah asked, concerned. "Is everything okay with the bill?" He looked up, embarrassment coloring his weathered face. "I'm sorry, Sarah, this is mortifying, but I seem to have left my wallet at home. I have my veteran's ID and my house key, but no money." He gestured to the few items he'd pulled from his pockets. I could go home and come back, or wash dishes, or— "Don't worry about it," Sarah interrupted without hesitation. "Breakfast is on me today." The old man's eyes widened. "I couldn't possibly—" "Please," Sarah insisted gently. "It would be my honor. My dad served in Desert Storm. He always said the bond between veterans is sacred." "Your father served?" Mr. Wilson asked, something changing in his expression. Sarah nodded. "Army, 2 tours. He passed away 3 years ago, cancer, from those burn pits they had over there." Mr. Wilson was silent for a moment, then reached out and patted her hand with surprising gentleness. "He raised a good daughter." "Thank you," Sarah replied, her throat suddenly tight. "Now please, let me take care of this. It's just breakfast." Just breakfast. $8.75 that she could barely afford to give away, but looking at Mr. Wilson's face, at the grief etched into every line, at the memories clearly weighing on him today, Sarah knew she wouldn't have made any other choice. She discreetly ripped up the check and entered the amount into the register using her employee meal discount, covering the rest from her meager tip money. Mr. Wilson thanked her profusely before leaving, his posture slightly straighter, his step a bit lighter than when he had arrived. Sarah watched him go, then turned her attention to cleaning his table. As she picked up the coffee cup, she noticed he had left behind the photograph. She carefully placed it in her apron pocket, knowing he would want it back. Perhaps she could drop it off at his house after her shift. She had his address from the few times she'd delivered food to him when he was recovering from hip surgery last year. The next 30 minutes passed in a blur of coffee refills, order taking, and table clearing. Sarah was so busy she barely registered the sudden hush that fell over the diner until Darlene appeared at her elbow, practically vibrating with excitement. "Sarah," she hissed, grabbing her arm with surprising strength. "Sarah, stop what you're doing right now and look at the door." Confused, Sarah turned toward the entrance, and nearly dropped the coffee pot she was holding. Standing just inside the doorway, flanked by what could only be security personnel in suits and earpieces, was Governor Eleanor Mitchell. She was dressed impeccably in a navy blue pantsuit, her silver hair styled perfectly, looking exactly as she did during her frequent television appearances. The diner, which moments ago had been filled with the typical Wednesday morning chatter, had fallen into stunned silence. "Is that—" Sarah began. "The governor," Darlene confirmed unnecessarily, "and she's looking right at you." Indeed, Governor Mitchell's gaze had locked onto Sarah, and she was walking purposefully across the diner toward her. The security personnel followed at a discreet distance, their eyes constantly scanning the room. "Are you Sarah Jenkins?" the governor asked when she reached her, her voice warm but authoritative. Sarah could only nod, still clutching the coffee pot like a lifeline. "Wonderful," Governor Mitchell smiled. "I was hoping to speak with you. Is there somewhere private we could talk for a moment?" Darlene immediately jumped in. "You can use Maggie's office in the back, Governor. It would be an honor." As the governor nodded her thanks, Sarah finally found her voice. "I'm sorry, but what is this about? Have I done something wrong?" Governor Mitchell's smile widened. "Quite the opposite, Ms. Jenkins. A friend of mine just called to tell me about an act of kindness he witnessed here this morning. I happened to be in the area for a veterans memorial service, and I wanted to thank you personally." A friend? An act of kindness? Sarah's confusion must have shown on her face because the governor continued, "Robert Wilson is a dear friend of mine. We've known each other for over 40 years. He was my late husband's commanding officer in Vietnam." Sarah's mind raced to catch up. Mr. Wilson knew the governor personally? The elderly man who came in every Wednesday morning for the $8 breakfast special. "He called me quite moved by your generosity," Governor Mitchell continued, "especially after learning about your father's service." Sarah felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. "It was just breakfast, ma'am. Anyone would have done the same." "But they didn't," the governor countered gently. "You did. And it meant more than you know. Today is a difficult day for Robert, for all of them who served in that unit. Your kindness gave him some faith when he needed it most." Before Sarah could respond, Maggie herself, the diner's owner who rarely made appearances before the lunch rush, emerged from the back office, her expression a mixture of shock and excitement at finding the governor of the state in her establishment. "Governor Mitchell, what an unexpected honor," Maggie exclaimed. "Please use my office for as long as you need." Sarah found herself being ushered into the small, cluttered office alongside the governor, while the security personnel positioned themselves outside the door. Her mind was still struggling to process what was happening. She had comped an $8 breakfast, and now the governor wanted a private conversation? Once the door closed behind them, Governor Mitchell's formal demeanor softened slightly. "I'll get straight to the point, Miss Jenkins. Robert told me a bit about you. Single mother, working 2 jobs, taking classes. I admire your determination." "Thank you," Sarah replied, wondering where this was heading. The governor sat down in Maggie's chair, motioning for Sarah to take the seat across from her. "I'm always looking for people with both compassion and work ethic to join my staff. As it happens, I have an opening for an administrative assistant in my Veterans Affairs office. The position comes with state benefits, including health insurance and a child care subsidy. Would you be interested?" Sarah stared at her, certain she had misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" "A job, Ms. Jenkins," Governor Mitchell repeated patiently. "In my administration. Starting salary is $42,000 annually, not a fortune, but better than waitressing, I imagine." Sarah's head swam with disbelief. $42,000, health insurance, child care assistance. It was more than double what she currently made between both her jobs. "But I don't have a degree yet," she managed to say. "I'm still working on my associates." "The state has an excellent tuition reimbursement program for employees," the governor countered smoothly. "You could finish your degree while working for us." "Why me?" Sarah asked, the question that kept circling in her mind. "Because I gave a veteran a free breakfast?" Governor Mitchell leaned forward slightly. "Because you showed compassion when it wasn't convenient. Because you honored a veteran's service with more than just words. Because Robert Wilson, who rarely asks for anything, called me this morning and said, 'Ellie, there's a young woman you should meet.' In 30 years of public service, I've learned to recognize character when I see it." Sarah's thoughts raced to Emma, to the possibility of a single job with regular hours, to health insurance that would cover her daughter's asthma medications without the constant stress of copays, to evenings free to help with homework instead of manning a grocery store register. I don't know what to say," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Say yes," Governor Mitchell smiled, "or at least say you'll come in for a formal interview next week. My chief of staff can provide all the details." It was too much to process. Sarah reached into her apron pocket, feeling the edges of Mr. Wilson's forgotten photograph. "He left this behind," she said, carefully placing it on the desk. "I was going to return it after my shift." The governor picked up the photo, a flash of recognition and sadness crossing her face. "That's them. The unit. My husband is on the far left, Robert is in the middle, and that's Mike," she pointed to a young man with a wide grin, "the friend they lost 54 years ago today." She handed the photo back to Sarah. "Keep it for now. You can return it to Robert yourself when you come in for your interview. I think he'd like that." Before Sarah could respond, there was a knock at the door, and one of the security personnel poked his head in. "Governor, we need to leave in 5 minutes to make the 11 o'clock meeting." Governor Mitchell nodded, then turned back to Sarah. "Do we have a deal, Ms. Jenkins? Will you at least come in for the interview?" Sarah looked down at the photograph of the young soldiers, then thought of her father, of Emma, of the constant struggle to make ends meet, of Mr. Wilson's trembling hands and grateful eyes. "Yes," she said, the word feeling momentous as it left her lips. "Yes, I'll come for the interview." "Excellent." The governor stood and extended her hand. "My office will call you with the details. And Sarah, thank you for reminding an old politician that small acts of kindness still matter in this world." As Governor Mitchell swept back through the diner, pausing briefly to shake hands with a few stunned patrons, Sarah remained in Maggie's office, trying to ground herself in the reality of what had just happened. Through the small window she could see the governor's motorcade pulling away. 3 black SUVs with the state flag fluttering on the hoods. When she finally emerged, the entire diner erupted in questions. Had the governor really offered her a job? Was it true she had connections to Mr. Wilson? What about the security detail? Were they armed? Maggie pulled her aside, concern etched on her face. "Sarah, honey, Are you leaving us? Because if it's about money, I might be able to." "It's not about money, Maggie," Sarah interrupted gently. "Or not just about money. It's about possibilities I never thought I'd have." She reached for the coffee pot she had abandoned earlier. "But I'm still here today. Table 9 needs refills." The rest of Sarah's shift passed in a dreamlike haze. News of the governor's visit spread quickly, and by noon the diner was packed with curious locals hoping to hear the story firsthand. Sarah recounted it so many times that it began to feel surreal, as if she were describing something that had happened to someone else. Her tips that day were the best she'd ever received, more than enough to cover the rent she'd been worried about that morning. But it wasn't the money that kept bringing tears to her eyes when she thought no one was looking. It was the photograph in her apron pocket. The young soldiers who had gone to war together. The ones who returned, carrying the memories of those who didn't. Mayo! And Mr. Wilson, who, 54 years later, still mourned his friend so deeply that he forgot his wallet on the anniversary of his death. Just after 3 o'clock, as Sarah was hanging up her apron and preparing to pick up Emma from school, her phone rang with an unfamiliar number. "Jenkins, this is Diane Mercer, the governor's chief of staff. I'm calling to schedule your interview and send you some preliminary paperwork." It was real, all of it. That evening, as Emma chattered excitedly about the possibility of moving closer to the capital, about having her mom home in the evenings, about not having to worry quite so much about money, Sarah sat at their small kitchen table, with Mr. Wilson's photograph propped against a salt shaker. Young men with their whole lives ahead of them, some whose futures had been cut short in a distant jungle, others, like Mr. Wilson, who had carried the weight of survival for over 5 decades. Sarah thought about the $8.75 she had written off that morning, a tiny amount that had seemed significant to her budget at the time. She thought about Emma's asthma medications, about night classes, about the constant calculations of which bill could wait another week. And she thought about what Governor Mitchell had said, small acts of kindness still matter in this world. Her phone pinged with a text message from a number she didn't recognize. "Sarah, Robert Wilson here. The governor gave me your number. I can't thank you enough for your kindness this morning. It meant more than you know, and I hear congratulations might soon be in order. Eleanor has an eye for good people, always has." Sarah smiled and began to type a reply, glancing at the photograph of the young soldiers as she did. In the background of the image, partially obscured by the group, was a tattered flag. Despite the faded quality of the photo, Sarah could make out the words stitched below it. Honor, courage, sacrifice. The same values her father had taught her, the same values she hoped to instill in Emma, the same values that had prompted her to tear up a check for $8.75 without a second thought. Sometimes the smallest kindnesses reveal our true character. And sometimes, just sometimes, 30 minutes is all it takes for life to change completely. Compassion costs little but changes everything.